Good evening. So I'd like to start by recognizing the traditional keepers of this land, so the Wampanoag people and the Narragansett people. And then I would like to thank Bob Purcell, Caitlin McCormack, and also Ariana Riva, who've secured my passage to Brown. And I've had some very interesting days of research since I've arrived, which I can talk to you about later. So, but first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to locate you. So just in case you don't know where the Southwest is, which you may laugh, but is often the case, it's important to locate ourselves, as we know. So what I'm talking about is really, if this works, this area. So when I'm talking over the next 40 minutes, I'm talking about that area of the Southwest, so the intersection between the kind of Navajo, the Zuni Reservation, and the area where jewelry is made. This talk is really the consequence of research that I did for the pursuit of publishing a book, and the book's on the right, called Surviving Desires. It resulted in a collection that I made for the British Museum, and in a sense, the book reverse engineered this research. So I started with the contemporary, and then I worked my way backwards, which is probably not a bad way of getting to know things. So, and those of you who have been in the field for a long time may know a curator called Jonathan King, and my mentor at the British Museum for a very considerable period of time was Jonathan King, and he and I worked on an exhibition and galleries together. And when he was publishing a book that was linked to our gallery called First People, First Contact, he basically stated the following: few collections, field or otherwise, came to the British Museum from the Southwest. So my starting point today is to say that whilst that may be the case, that's not necessarily the most useful way of understanding historic collections from the Southwest. So maybe they aren't the largest collections in museums, but they are a prism through which we can understand the way people associated, the way museums collected, and in particular the way museums in London, Cambridge, Oxford, and Edinburgh saw themselves as node in an anthropological trading network. So anthropological knowledge in museums and trading happened between these institutions. So to illustrate a point, we can look at this collection. This collection was created by James Cree. James Cree was Scots. He moved to New Mexico with his family in 1885 to 1903. His father had fallen out somehow or another with the rest of his family and fallen on hard times. And James Cree, the younger, as it were, was a rather successful rancher. And in 1903 deposited a group of objects with the National Museums of Scotland, then known as the Royal Scottish Museum, where they stayed really till 1939. And in 1939, his daughter contacted Edinburgh and asked whether or not we would buy the collection. And the collection at the time had a lot of ancestral pottery in it. It also had jewelry and clothing, and relating to both Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache people. So Edinburgh scooped up all of the, what we would now call, ethnographic collections, and then proceeded to act as an agent for the sale of the rest of the collections to Oxford, London, and Cambridge. Oxford essentially refused. And so just the point that I want to make is Robert Kerr, who was the keeper of the Department of Art and Ethnography at the time, basically wrote to Irene Cree and said, beyond the British, which means the British Museum, Cambridge and Oxford, to which I have now offered your specimens, I do not know of any museums which are likely to purchase this kind of pottery. So it's very intriguing to understand how these objects circulated and to think of them really in terms of their circulation, their entanglements, and essentially the micro-histories of these collections and how different people were linked to each other. So if we think of the Southwest as an area that was not systematically collected, you also have to recognize that UK institutions had cognizance of that absence. So there's sufficient evidence, both in the late 19th and early 20th century, that UK museums were responding to the intellectual presence of this material in North American institutions and to their relative lack, and that this was one of the triggers that galvanized them in collecting the Southwest. So all those who work in historic museum collections are alert to the ebb and flow of materials through their institutions at the hands of individuals, and the errors and opportunities that characterize this very human activity, sometimes disguised in the anthropological field as science. In recent years, it has become common to think of objects and museum collections in terms of their entangled histories, in the belief that whilst the conventional view is that people collect objects, the reverse is also true, namely that objects collect people. So this lecture is looking at the makers, the dealers, the agents, and the curators who formed and interpreted and displayed Southwestern collections, particularly jewellery, in UK museums. So if we look at the earliest collections, the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s, what we see is museums in the UK deploying a mixed strategy of acquisitions. But they're also linked to the major anthropological and collecting enterprises that characterize the intellectual prizing open of the Southwest. Those anthropological foraging efforts underway through the Bureau of American Ethnology and the US National Museum, or the Smithsonian. So this is a way in which research expeditions were undertaken. So they were undertaken with a collecting purpose, as many of you know, and collecting itself secured the opportunity of doing that again. It's also an expression, as we now understand, of a way in which Southwestern peoples assessed and controlled the market value of their material culture and demonstrated agencies, what they were willing to trade and what they retained. And that's also something that we need to think about when we're thinking of institutions trading. So as Nancy Perizzo has comprehensively demonstrated, these extensive surveys gathered immense and varied collections. Collecting was undertaken and funded, and it underpinned by a sense of moral duty and salvage. And the statistics remain staggering. Through these means, the Smithsonian collected 41,500 objects in 30 years from the Southwest, and Perizzo estimates the expeditions to the Pueblo of Zuni between 1879 and 1887 acquired 5 items for every man, woman, and child resident in the village. So as a national institution, the Smithsonian started to exchange all over the world. And in this model, trusted professional colleagues traded books and collections according to a broadly well understood view of like for like, dispatching packages of collections to fill perceived gaps, and sometimes through agents. So one of the first pieces to come in the British Museum's collection is this wrist guard or bow guard. It's one of 4 pairs that were collected by James Stevenson and Matilda Cox Stevenson in the Pueblo of Zuni from 1884 to 1885. And so one came into the British Museum. So one of the aspects of this is it's not silver, but it's a white metal in that sense. And the other aspect is that while she collected 4 pairs, or she's talking about it as 4 pairs, 4 of those items ended up in other collections. So one's in Copenhagen, one's in the Peabody, and one's in the Pigarini Museum in Florence. So this exchange was organized by someone called Augustus Wollaston Franks on behalf of something called the Christie Collection. So one of the reasons why this collection sometimes sort of disappears in our understanding of the British Museum is that the British Museum didn't actually exchange it. The Christie Collection exchanged it with the Smithsonian. And Augustus Wollaston Franks, who's often thought of as the second director, the second founder of the British Museum due to his collecting activities in the mid to late 19th century, was a trustee of the Christie Collection. So he was exchanging this material with third parties, and then that material was coming into the British Museum's collection. So through those offices in 1890 to 1891, the Smithsonian set up a series of exchanges, and the British Museum acquired 53 items from 1st and 2nd Mesa in Hopi, and also from the Pueblo of Zuni. within the jewelry collection, in broad terms, is a series of pieces of turquoise. So here you have the ledger, which is on the right, you have the ledger, and there the entry, sacred pieces of turquoise. One of the interesting aspects of this is whilst it came in as sacred pieces of turquoise, and we also, the British Museum also acquired paint at the time, this collection of turquoise, which I think shows essentially the process of making beads, because you've got a bead up there, and you've got ways in which they're modified, and you've got different colors of turquoise. So it's showing you bead making at one level, was never accessioned into the collections. So until we started to do this research, they ceased to exist as a part of the accessioned collections. So one of the interesting aspects of all of these collections is the whole notion of negotiation. So because it's in the Christie collection, the Christie letters are there, or the letters that were written by Otis T. Mason from the Smithsonian to Charles Hercules Reed from the British Museum. And my favorite my favorite aspect of reading such letters is when people are basically delicately refusing an offer. So the British Museum wanted Frank Hamilton Cushion's entire collection of Zuni fetishes for the 35 pieces of South African material that it was sending to the Smithsonian in Washington, and Otis Mason declined. So in his earlier correspondence, he said that he would send the museum an entire set of Zuni fetishes. Then he moderated it and said he would only send duplicates. And then finally he writes, "I could send you a handful of them promiscuously, but I prefer to pick them out and have them talk intelligently," which means basically he was refusing. So that's one of the interesting aspects of doing this kind of research. In the 1890s, the British Museum also acquired a series of Southwestern jewellery that came from a missionary called the Reverend Charles Selwyn Freer, and he travelled across the Southwest going to California, and so collected these pieces and gave them a particular, at the time, rather good provenance. So he's basically telling us where he's buying this material. So that's another series of pieces that come through into the British Museum. At this point, Edinburgh is collecting from dealers. So we collected from a dealer called William Downing Webster. And one of the aspects of the British context is the sheer preponderance of dealers in the late 19th and early 20th century, a phenomenon documented by Jonathan King, and W.D. Webster is one of those very prominent dealers, and it's through him that we acquire a pump drill from Cochety in 1897. The other interesting aspect is that Cambridge is acquiring Smithsonian material through Florence. So a Florentine collector called Eric Giglioli, who created the Pigarini Museum in Florence, is also exchanging with UK museums. But perhaps more surprising is one of the best collections of early Navajo jewellery, so late 19th century jewellery, can be found in the Royal Cornish Museum in Truro, so a very small museum in Cornwall, and it's a rich assemblage of material that was collected by Thomas Varker Keam. Thomas Keam was Cornish, and he started his American career as an army interpreter and became a gifted reservation trader. So from 1876 to 1895, he lived and worked in Arizona, in Keam's Canyon, and his trading post was a hub for all of those taking part in research, and he extended comfort to all of the expeditions that went into the Southwest. And the Royal Cornish Museum have 35 pieces from Keam, and the date of Keam's gift link it somewhat to the Smithsonian Institution, because it dates from after the exhibition that he created for the World's Columbian exhibition in 1893. So again, these connections between different moments, and early Navajo jewelry was seen as an industrial art. So one of the interesting differences that emerges in the 19th century between lapidary work and Navajo work is Navajo is often seen as an industrial art, and turquoise and lapidary work is often seen in his sort of extended history, the sort of extended history to the pre-contact. So it was collected as an industrial art. And one of the ways of understanding these collections is to think about intent. So to what extent were they collected intentionally or with an intellectual objective? And Nancy Perizzo, who's worked a lot on the Smithsonian collection, makes this difference between active and passive collecting. So active collecting is collecting in the context of research. Passive collecting is essentially picking things up as you go along. And Mike O'Hanlon, who was the former director of the Pitt Rivers Museum, is also looking at those distinctions. So what is a primary collection? A collection with an intellectual objective. A secondary collection is a collection made with intent, but that wasn't the primary objective. And a concomitant collection, which is more sort of picking up as you go along. And so these collections in London, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and Oxford have different aspects of these. They're not driven by research in a sense, but they are the consequence of research. So one of the most important, I think, collections is made in the 1920s, and it's made by these two gentlemen on the bottom. On the left, you have Thomas Attell Joyce, who's the curator at the British Museum, and on the right, you have Lewis Colville Clark, from the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. You have Harman Hendricks, George Gustav High, Thea High, and I can't remember her name, and Mariana Hall and her grandchildren. So this photograph is in Cambridge, and it's the only photograph of this kind. So in 1923, Thomas Attell Joyce from the British Museum spent 3 months in the USA, traveling from the East Coast to California, and he spent 3 weeks in Zuni. He witnessed excavations at 2 sites, Hariku and Kechibawa, and undertook fieldwork. And this was all at the invitation of George Gustav High, director of the Museum of the American Indian. Joyce, by this point, was as a part of a network of British and American scholars who were unified in their interest in Central and South American antiquities, on which he'd already published. And he just, in fact, reinstalled a gallery at the British Museum on this subject. And he was invited by George Gustav High. They were on familiar terms because of this interest, and High formally requested that he be relieved from his duties at the British Museum so that he can meet American colleagues in American museums, spend time doing archaeology. And High argued, archaeology has now reached the stage at which only by international cooperation and exchange of ideas can the best results be produced. I regard it as highly important that fieldworkers and theorists on both sides of the Atlantic should be brought into touch personally, and it is with that object in view that I venture to make this request. So High promised to underwrite the whole trip. It had extended by that point to include Lewis Colville Clark, who'd just recently been appointed at the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and Clark had a more long-term involvement in the archaeological aspect of this expedition, and Cambridge essentially supported that archaeological work and therefore claimed some of the objects. So as part of this, it's important to note that Joyce and Clark had this extremely intimate friendship. Their letters are part of the British Museum archive. They corresponded on almost a daily basis, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. They exchanged lively gossip about objects, about dealers, about collections. Joyce often put things aside for Clark so he could buy them. Some of the preparations of going to America is an exchange about who could outfit them better, which British and London-based outfitters would be best for travel. Joyce seems to have done a little more at Clark's bidding. So Clark was personally wealthy and also collected and gifted collections. So their relationship is also based on the gifts that Clark made to the British Museum's collections. So both of them departed in June 1923, and Joyce returned in 28th of September. Joyce spent approximately 3 weeks in New Mexico, and he was delegated some role he claimed in relationship to the cinematography of daily life, craft practices, and ceremonies and ceremonial life. So one of the key aspects of the Harman Hendricks, the Hendricks-Hodge expedition was that they built this enormous visual archive and did a lot of filming, and some of those films are still in the American Museum of Natural History. So he wrote when he came back to London, "The experience has been the greatest value to me and has also been of considerable material advantage to the British Museum." So that's his report on the right to the trustees. And he also made a series of suggestions about the difference between UK museums and American museums. So he noted that while the UK spent quite a lot of time thinking about display, the US spent a lot of time thinking about research. And so he counseled a sort of re-engineering of that emphasis. He was also very keen on fieldwork to understand the pace of change amongst native communities. And he came back with a substantial argument about the benefits of exchange. So the Hendricks-Hodge expedition of 1917 to 1923 was one of the most extensive archaeological investigations of a single site of its time, resulting in large and diverse collections which spread across a number of institutions in the US. The sixth season, so there wasn't a season in 1922, were generously underwritten by Harman Hendricks, who was a copper magnate and a benefactor and trustee of the Museum of the American Indian. Frederick Hodge was the director of this expedition. He had worked with Frank Hamilton Cushing, and in fact, his wife was Cushing's sister-in-law, and he was part of the multidisciplinary Hemingway Southwestern Archaeological Expedition. So he has this extraordinary lineage in Zuni and a lot of experience that really starts in the late 1880s and moves all the way through to the 1920s. So Zuni participants were very active in the digging and contributed interpretations as regard to finds. And so there were different teams every year, but at the same time there was a sort of solid group of Zuni workmen that Hodge referred to as staunch friends. Joyce and Clark were extremely convinced about the conviviality of this relationship and the productivity, and this, I believe, is the site they all lived in, and it was called Camp Hendricks, and it was near a village called Ojo Caliente. So Clark recorded in some of his notes, "The Zuni workmen who dig for us are the best workmen at the job I ever saw." So there's this great affection and sense of well-being coming through the literature that the British curators generate. So in October, 26 boxes were dispatched from New York from the Museum of the American Indian. So the contract that Cambridge had with the Museum of the American Indian is that George Gustav Heye had first choice in regard to everything. So anything that was dug up at the sites belonged to Heye first. But in fact, he was incredibly generous with Clark, so he sent much more than Cambridge was expecting. And Hodge himself was also generous. They bought things that they thought would complete the London collections. So they bought pottery tools, they bought weaving equipment, and these earrings, which are these scalloped earrings, these forged Zuni earrings, rather plain, so what then Hodge described as an obsolete style, were packaged up by Hodge for Joyce. So they weren't collected by the English curators, they were packaged up for them. So one of the aspects of this is the way it's documented. So when Caitlin and I were working on something called the John Ray collection, it started to seem to me that curators are imposing these extraordinary orders on their collections. So they've got nothing to do with the chronology. In this case, it's got everything to do with their notion of what the significance of things are. So in this instance, it's quite interesting that Joyce is cataloguing these two objects first. They're his gifts, and they relate to him in a sense that he's gifted them to the museum. Then there's this and the following page, and they're ascribed to someone called Captain Alfred Fuller. So another one of these funny serpentine scenarios is that Fuller bought the material for the British Museum, which he then sold to the British Museum. So he acts as an agent, and it's all to do with government accounting at the time. But then they're ordering it in terms, I would argue, of ceremonial value. So he starts with objects related to ceremonial life. Then he's doing jewelry, which Joyce does think of as a ceremonial object. Then they're looking at fetishes, and as you go across the page, they start to look at potsherds. And finally, they come to this piece, and this is a concha belt. And interestingly, there's no paper trail for, there's no paper trail for the concha belt. So we don't know whether the concha belt was bought in Zuni. The concha belt that Lewis Colville Clark bought was bought in Zuni. However, Joyce was also going to well-known trading stores outside and dealing with dealers. So one of the interesting separations that you see in the cataloguing of these collections is, I think, the thought process of the curator. So he's reordering it. And that came to me partly because that's what I did when I made a field collecting. I didn't order it in terms of time or when I bought it. I gave it a hierarchy that I subsequently understood. So reading this feels the same. So one of the areas where they bought their collection is in this trading store called the Islesfield Trading Company. And this was a very prominent and important trading store in Zuni. And this, both Clark and Joyce bought older pottery. So this is not pottery they saw made, but pottery they wanted for their collection, and they bought it in the trading store. That's one of the important aspects of the way, the differentiation of what goes on at this time. So one of the interesting aspects in terms of jewelry is the earrings. So Joyce bought 3 sets of earrings. The 2 sets on the left and on the right he describes as brooches, partly because he's not really convinced, I think, that anybody could wear such large earrings. They're made out of forged silver. They're set with hand-cut stones. And the moment when they're bought makes them important because they're part of the commercialization of Zuni jewelry, which was the change in which Charles Kelsey, who was the trader at Islesfield Trading Store, and C.G. Wallace, who was another trader who first worked for Kelsey and then owned his own trading store, they were manifest in changing the nature of Zuni jewelry as a craft. So in the 1920s, the Zuni jewelry is still being made largely for internal consumption or for trading purposes. It's not being made and sold as a commercial art in the way that we sort of understand it today. It is hand-cut stones, forged silver, and here you see the beginning of a sort of filigree style, which is that's hand-drawn flattened wire here. And one of the interesting aspects of these earrings is they look the same, but that's a plate that's pierced. So essentially it's punched through, which is the older style, the style that you get with, for example, concha belts here. So that's a punched through, that's an ingot punched through. And what then becomes more of a Zuni style, which is this filigree, the use of wire. So these earrings, which were bought as a pair, are actually made completely differently. The other interesting aspect, so these earrings were bought by Thea High. So they're also bought as a pair, but if you notice, there are 4 holes there and 5 holes there. And if you notice, there's an asymmetry of holes. If we think about Zuni jewelry at this period in time, John Adair, who was doing a lot of work in the 1940s on jewelry, both on the Navajo and the Zuni reservation, argues that there are only 9 practicing silversmiths at the time. So you're looking at the work of a very small group of people. None of the silversmiths are identified, but at the same time, it's thought-provoking to think about that. Another aspect of the collecting is that Cambridge got 500 pieces of, so mostly ceramics from the excavation, got about 35 items in the ethnographic collection, of which a number were jewellery, and they got a number of necklaces, so they got squash blossom necklaces, they got turquoise and shell necklaces, they got this bracelet, they acquired the bracelet. They acquired no earrings. So one of the other arguments, or speculative arguments, is, in fact, even though it's clear that Clarke had much greater access to funds, some of which were his own, than Joyce did, it doesn't seem like there was so much you could buy in Zuni at the time that they didn't, in fact, need to separate off what they were each buying. So London ends up with more earrings, and Cambridge ends up with more bracelets and more necklaces. So there's this, there's an issue, or there's possibly an issue about access to objects. Common to both collections are these inlaid pendants, these spondylus shell neck pieces. And if you were to read the acquisition log in the British Museum, this is the one that was gifted. This is the one that sort of, in a sense, its ceremonial importance is really emphasized. And it's particularly emphasized because Joyce refers back to Matilda Cox-Stevenson's work and refers to that work. In Clarke is a much better auditor of the process of collecting. So he'll tell you where he bought something, he'll tell you who he bought it from, and he'll tell you whether he thinks it was made or worn in Zuni. So the equivalent in Cambridge is actually a much more elegant piece, which Clarke describes as having belonged to the Lieutenant Governor of Zuni Pueblo. And the other thing just to note is that the way they give it, they validate this piece, this object, and the technology within it, and reinforce and support the discourse of continuity in terms of jewelry manufacture and significance, is by referring it to a Nazca piece, so a Peruvian piece which Lewis Colville Clarke gave to the British Museum. So Clarke is also referring to his own gift to the British Museum as a way of essentially supporting the ceremonial value of this object. So as a consequence, you can disciplinary debt to these early expeditions to the southwest. So they're referring back to the expeditions, they're collecting things that they see in the US National Museum. So their imagination, their framework is sort of jewelry as ceremony and jewelry as part of cultural continuity. They also collected things that they thought of more in the realm of craft. And jewelry isn't really seen that way, but pottery is. So part of the visual documentation that went on during the Heinrich Hodge expedition is the documentation of pottery, and it's clear that Joyce wanted the pottery he saw made, and you can see the relationship between the piece that's being made in the photograph and just the skill and the form and the type of the one that the British Museum bought. So this is different than the previous piece of Zuni pottery, which was bought at a trading store as being deliberately historic. This is being bought as a piece of contemporary craft, which is then documented. So one of the aspects of that is that the British Museum, whilst it wanted documentation and photographs, doesn't currently have a great deal. So Cambridge have a much better photographic set, have a set of photographs of all of the people who participated in the excavation, and one can link those photographs to the objects in the collections, particularly to some donations that were made by Zuni workmen to Clark, which Clark then donated to Cambridge. The photographic record, so they do record lapidary work, and one of the things that we know about the Heinrich Hodge expedition is that several of the Zuni men who later became very important jewelers, so Like de Jus, Teddy Wiyaki, Warren Ondelansi, and also Zuni Dick, who's this jeweler, were part of the excavation. And Zuni Dick was often photographed demonstrating lapidary work, and then he's sort of, in a sense, embodied in that piece by Teddy Wiyaki. So these posed photographs on the left were used by Cambridge for a long period of time, and they had a little demonstration about the stages of creating turquoise jewelry. But then we also have these photographs of the first female Zuni silversmith, who's called Della Casa Appa. And Della Casa Appa here is pictured with her husband. The husband, and so Della Casa Appa's work is known. Her husband, who taught her silversmithing, his work is not known. So one of the questions is, why is that photograph? So why did Cambridge choose these photographs to put in its collection? Oh, well, on the right-hand side, it's clear because you can see Clark wearing the necklace that he subsequently gave to the museum, and this necklace has been tentatively identified as the work of Likia Dayus, partly because of these elements, these highly carved elements. So it isn't, and this is Samuel Lawthorpe, who was the manager of the excavation, and despite attempts at the moment, I can't identify the person in the Zuni person in the middle. So there are still questions about why these, particularly why is it about jewelry being worn, or is it about the jewelers who made the jewelry that's actually in the collection? So the British Museum and Cambridge Museum conceived of these collections at the time to be very important. It was very important to their own intellectual development. It was, I would say, it was an important acquisition event. It was a period of change in Zuni in regard particularly to the making of silver and jewelry, as they hadn't undergone the rapid commercialization of craft, but it was also indebted to an earlier lineage of anthropological fieldwork. So it's not the type of fieldwork that then came into being under people like Ruth Bundle or Ruth Benedict. One of the aspects of this expedition is it proved to be quite controversial in the end because of the filming of Zuni ceremonial practices and pilgrimages. And it all came to a head in November of 1923 when one of the filmmakers who was employed, called Owen Cattell, was filming the Shalako ceremony. And this has been theorized since as a tension between the conservatives and the progressives in Zuni Pueblo. But what's clear is that this expedition changed the terms of engagement in Zuni. So in a way, it's a very particular kind of moment and should be understood in that sense. So if we go from Oxford to Cambridge, from Cambridge to Oxford, a very different set of people are collecting in the 40s. And this is Beatrice Blackwood. Beatrice Blackwood is a very important member of the Oxford Anthropological Fraternity, and she started doing her fieldwork in the 1920s when she did fieldwork in relationship to physical anthropology. She was a keen photographer, and as part of having a fellowship in the US in 1926-27, she traveled to the Southwest. There she met Maria Chabot on the left. Maria Chabot was a very unconventional character. She was Texas-born, she'd lived in Mexico, and by this point she worked for the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts. And she is generally recognized to have been the originator of Indian market. So in a way, Blackwood, by making these collections that she made, the associations she made in the 20s, and the collections she made in the 30s, and the collection she commissioned from Maria Chabot in the 1940s is sort of part of this network that was in the southwest. So not the East Coast, but the actual southwest. That network of wealthy patrons and craft reformers, people like Edgar Lee Hewitt and Kenneth Chapman, places like the Museum of New Mexico, the School of American Research, the Lab of Anthropology. And most particularly, both of these women were part of this network of very significant women artists and patrons who essentially changed the way in which people appreciated Southwestern native arts, and particularly Southwestern jewellery. So Margaret Blackwood was going to go to the Southwest in 1939, and she wrote to Maria Chabot and told her of her travel plans and asked for assistance. So she knew of Chabot's work with silversmiths, such as Ambrose Roanhorse, whose work you see here, and her involvement with the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. And she asked for advice. Who should she purchase from to create significant, a collection of significant modern Indian things to illustrate the lectures on ethnology? So in a sense, the course work had changed in Oxford. And Maria Chabot recommended Ambrose Roanhorse, who you see here, who was teaching at the Santa Fe Indian School, Chester Yellowhair, who was teaching at the Albuquerque Indian School, and Dooley Shorty, who was teaching at the Fort Wingate Indian School. And as a side note, it's quite interesting to know that Dooley Shorty came here in the 1940s to be trained at the Rhode Island School of Design on a summer school. So what happened in 1939 was the outbreak of the Second World War. So all of Beatrice Blackwood's plans were re-engineered as a consequence of that. She ended up in July in San Francisco. She went to the Golden Gate International Exposition, and there she met two other really important figures in the development and appreciation of Native American arts and crafts, Frederick Douglass and Renee Darncourt. And Frederick Douglass and Darncourt helped her purchase the material she purchased for the collections at the Golden Gate International Exposition. And Blackwood wrote a fairly detailed diary at the time, and she gives this very intriguing glimpse of the Indian court as this site of encounter. So all of these curators being gathered at the Indian court at the Golden Gate International Exhibition, a thoroughfare where curators, academics, and dealers were congregating, were lunching with each other, were discussing Indian art, were identifying collecting opportunities and networking. And a lot of the collections that Beatrice Blackwood got at that point is through these connections, either in San Francisco at the Golden Gate International Exposition, or in Santa Fe through the offices of people like Chabot, of Dorothea Stewart, who was one of these women patrons who lived in Santa Fe, who advised her to go to Frank Patania's Thunderbird shop, where Beatrice Blackwood had an opal bracelet made for herself and seems to have bought this piece. So her diary is finished on the 2nd of September 1939 because war broke out, and it seems she was quite depressed as a consequence and was trying to go home. However, the Pitt Rivers Museum commissioned, as a consequence, because her work was interrupted, they commissioned Maria Chabot to go and make a collection for them. And Maria Chabot at this point was working for the New Mexican Association on Indian Affairs, which became the Southwestern Association on Indian Arts. But at the time, the New Mexican Association on Indian Affairs was a campaigning activist organization looking at indigenous rights. And a Navajo delegation came in 1940. They were a grievance committee, and they wanted someone to investigate the impact on the reservation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs livestock reduction program. And so Maria Chabot put these two ideas together. She went and did the report called Urgent Navajo Problems, which looked at the economic impact of the livestock reduction program, and drew heavily on Navajo testimony, and looked at, in consequence of this, looked at what was happening to the trading system and to what was happening to the pawn system. So the system on the Navajo reservation was to put your jewelry in pawn with a trader and then to be able to recoup it as wool and lambs got sold and created the more fluid economy. But what was happening during the livestock reduction program is that traders were selling the jewellery off because the lambs and wool were not making, well, they weren't, number one, they were being reduced, number two, they were selling for less. So Maria Chabot made this rather extraordinary collection. So she was very conscious of collecting at a moment of change. So she knew that what she wanted to do was reflect commercialization on one hand, the flight of porn on the other, and change. And one of the things she collected are these 3 sections of squash blossom necklaces. So they're literally sections. And you can see they're varied sizes, they're varied styles. And she, in doing this, she's actually giving us the evidence that backs up John Adair's work. So John Adair, the very significant historian of Navajo and Pueblo jewelry in the mid-20th century, talks about bead making in Pinedale and how much bead makers were paid. So you got paid 1 cent per bead if it was 60 millimeters, and you got paid 4 cents. So you got paid 1 to 4 cents per bead. And what we have here in the Pitt Rivers Museum, in a slightly unlikely way, is a representation of how those things were manufactured, how these lengths of beads, which were then sold, which were then made up into jewelry, were manufactured. And so she's doing quite a lot with assemblage, which is very interesting. So unlike Joyce, who's collecting one of each, she's collecting series of each thing. So a series of rings, a series of squash blossom necklace parts, and a series of buttons to show how what is happening on the reservation, what is happening to craftsmanship. So her, in a sense, imaginary is very much influenced by discussions about the nature of craft. And the Pitt Rivers Museum saw this at the time as a rare, valuable, and beautiful collection made by an unrivaled expert under conditions which may never occur again. And one of the aspects of this is that, in a way, so it may seem an overstatement, given the fact that it's a relatively discrete collection, but they're not wrong, because she's one of the few people at the time who's documenting change. Everybody else is documenting tradition, and Maria Chabot is documenting change. And she continued to write to Beatrice Blackwood until the 60s. So their conversation is still about jewelry and craft into the 60s, so you can actually trace it forward. It also, what I like about this collection, of course, is the fact that it works through ideas of commerce and craft, both thinking about it materially and intellectually, and it does embed the importance of these women who essentially created, popularized, theorized craft in the Southwest at the time. And as we all know, women are often less well represented in the histories of collecting than our male colleagues. Finally, this is a particular, so it sort of takes up, it moves the story forward into the 50s. So if the Southwest was being collected in the Northeast and New York and Washington and the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, by the mid-20th century, the Denver Art Museum, of course, was a much more significant player in this field. And a key individual in that player was Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass we've already encountered. He was at the Indian Court with Beatrice Blackwood. He has a very lively correspondence with Beatrice Blackwood. And in the 1940s, he becomes momentarily the director of Denver, and he creates a native arts post which extends to Africa and the Pacific. And then during the Second World War, he is actually in service in the ocean nation of Vanuatu. And when he comes back from the war, he wants to start exchanging North American material for Africa and Pacific material. And he goes to Sweden and Finland and drops by London and Oxford, meets Beatrice Blackwood, and decides that the best thing to do is to start exchanging. So the Edinburgh and Denver exchange is quite well documented. In a sense, there's a lively and candid correspondence between Cyril Aldred on the right and Frederick Douglass on the left. And I think one of the reasons this exchange is quite intriguing is because Aldred and Douglas were kindred spirits. So one of the things I think we start to realize is that actually a lot of these professional associations and networks are made by people who have a sympathy. Their kind of priorities resonate. Both of these men were charismatic and intellectual pioneers in their chosen field, Douglas in relationship to Native American art, and Aldred in relationship to ancient Egyptian art. Aldred is a very, very significant figure in ancient Egyptian art. So they start this correspondence with lists. So it's a very interesting series of very diplomatic engagements, talking about mutual benefits, about wants, about good quality duplicates. One of the aspects of what was happening at Edinburgh at the time is that we had a director who was very clear that we should deaccession and exchange. So it also coincides with the moment we're getting loan collections, but we're exchanging these loan collections. So what we discover is that so there are two sorts of discoveries. The first is that Edinburgh wants a range of objects, and Douglas wants very specific art objects. So Edinburgh is always talking about specimens, Douglas is always talking about art. But Douglas is also very conscious that when he's talking about art or when Aldred is talking about specimens, they're actually talking about the same thing. So they're playing a sort of institutional subtext type game. The other aspect is that there are some elisions. So I was rather confused by this necklace on the left until I realized one of the confusions is this drawing, which is part of the record card at Denver. Because it makes it look as if this is a necklace, essentially a series of beads with a pendant. But what you find when you go through the Denver Art Museum records is that they came in as two separate objects, and they were combined by Denver. One of the theories is that Denver exchanged objects that didn't have as deep a provenance as might be ideal. The other thing that we know is that Edinburgh acquired, if you look at the many types of Indian jewellery, you'll notice that we acquired pieces from a range of different styles, and in particular we acquired number 10. So we acquired different, Douglas was sending us a series in terms of showing us different types of material, and we were sending Douglas Pacific material specifically, but also we gave him gifts. So when material was being deaccessioned from the African collection, that was also sent to Denver, but it wasn't formally part of the exchange. So one of the things that I think in the 20th century we find slightly peculiar is that actually curators are being given the license to exchange this material on an entirely subjective and sort of gentlemanly type way. And you can think of this, so you can think of that they're treating these objects like commodities, or you can think of them as they're treating them like gifts. So if gifts are particularly valuable objects that are circulating in restricted frames according to certain regimes of value, essentially these objects are being given they're being given a commodity phase in their life, but it's very circumscribed. The other aspect that's quite intriguing is that Denver Art Museum always wanted or repeatedly requested pieces from our Hudson Bay Company collection. So the very early 18th century, the collections that were made in the 18th century or the mid-19th century. And Edinburgh never gave this any serious considerations. Similarly, Edinburgh repeatedly asked for silversmithing equipment and molds, and we know that the John Adair pieces were already in Denver, and they wouldn't exchange. So one of the other aspects is what can and cannot be exchanged, which again lends support to this idea that they're gifts. And it comes back to the point at the beginning, which is how these relationships are built on the basis of like for like, that they're using these value systems about what is the equivalent of something else. And my favorite sort of quote from Douglas is he says, "On the whole, I think we can even up fairly well, with me evening up your quality and rarity with a wider range and more objects. So, in 1881, Otis Mason wrote, "Anthropology is not concerned with individuals. It does not inquire how he or they acted or thought. That is biography or history. It is ever asking how they were accustomed to act." So I rather like this quote, because I think from today's perspective, Mason's confident anti-biographical definition of the anthropological project seems amusingly misguided to us. And so the point of this, and I'm sorry you might not be able to read it, this is a foreshortened letter it's actually a 3-page letter between Douglas and Aldred. But I do like the fact that it's saying, further evidence of insatiable greed. It's this sort of funny language that they have with each other, which shows a level of intimacy and a sort of a conviviality between them. And so the lecture is really about understanding the texture of UK collections, what the material is, what the objects are, and the dynamics and relationships that allow them to come to being, to untangle these micro-histories, to understand the relationships between people like Joyce and Clark and their long-standing friendship, Blackwood and Chabot and their long-standing friendship. Unfortunately, Douglas died in 1956, so he and Aldred's relationship ceased at that point. Because I think it's precisely understanding those human textures of collections that will allow us as anthropologists, but also as museum curators, to repersonalize them, and thus, in a way, to to understand them as the bedrock for the collaborative work that we want to do today, that they are the product of a mixed economy of buying and trading and commissioning and accepting gifts. And in that sense, they are very textured things. They're human, they're not science. Thank you.